Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. So today the topic will be a pragmatic approach to operationalizing UK SOX. So I will be presenting this whole session today. So a quick intro of myself. So my name's Yang. I'm a senior director at SureCloud. My responsibility is to head the pre-sales as well as the customer success function here. So one of the other responsibilities I look at is how do we ensure the end-to-end customer journey is appropriate for all our customers and the customers getting the value out of them, a consistent experience as well as an end product that it meets the business need. And then followed by that is after go live from a customer success perspective, how do we make sure the product is aligned to the business culture? And if anything change happens, how do we make sure that that solution is updated to support that? Before joining SureCloud, I used to work at IBM as well as Deloitte. So I used to be a process engineer helping develop target operating models and different financial tax processes, as well as being a GRC SME at Deloitte, where I help clients define different risk and compliance frameworks, methodologies, as well as processes. So before we look at how to operationalize UK SOX, let's first have a rewind and just go through some facts about UK SOX. So first of all, from a timeline perspective, the Financial Reporting Council have had its eyes on a UK equivalent of the US Sarbanes-Oxley Act for years. And then earlier this year in March, the government or the BEIS submitted a white paper of how to restore trust in audit and corporate governance for stakeholders, primarily investors. Not sure if everyone's read the white paper, but what's in the white paper is various means of how audit can be involved to ensure there's stronger control in place. But one thing hasn't been finalized is the time frame to enforce these future requirements for listed companies. So unfortunately, we don't know when UK SOX will be finalized and when these premium listed company will need to be compliant. But drawing experience from the US SOX, we know that the first round of companies had about 2 full reporting years before they were asked to be compliant, or they had 2 years to prepare to become compliant. And where we're at right now is already Q4 of 2021. So the earliest for this SOX UK legislation to be finalized would be 2022, right? So based on that US experience, I would assume that the earliest these premium listed companies need to be compliant would be 2 years from 2022. So the earliest would be 2024. And then just quickly going through kind of the purpose of UK SOX. So like what the white paper title suggests, is restoring trust and confidence in the audit and corporate compliance of listed companies, and also enforcing companies to adopt a much stronger or strengthened internal control framework for compliance. What's quite interesting is, just like the SOX in the States, is we require now with this new white paper is for directors to start a test to the effectiveness of their internal controls. 3 options were listed in the white paper. The first option is that directors and the board need to attest to all aspects of the internal control as well as risk management procedures. The second option is limiting it to just the internal control structure and procedures that's relevant for financial reporting, but with an element now that auditors need to join into the conversation as well as to review the soundness of those attestations and provide their own observation, which is very similar to how SOX operates in the US, hence the UK version of SOX. And then option 3 is, again, looking at the attestation of directors, but limiting it to a selected grouping of controls that impacts specific areas of financial reports, and having auditors then provide a formal opinion of how that assessment has been done or attestation has been done. So a bit similar to SOC 1. Now the government is more prone towards option 2 at this point. which means that speculating to the future, UK SOX will look probably very similar to US SOX. But again, that's only a speculation at this point. What we need to bear in mind is looking into something like SOX, it's always going to be driven from a top-down approach. It's always going to be, what are the key areas I'm looking at? How does my current operating landscape align to the financial reports I provide? Thus, what does it mean then looking downwards into the risk and compliance landscape? So SOX should not be approached as a bottom-up approach because the direction is actually coming from the top. I know for many, the whole idea of a UK SOX is a headache from the compliance landscape. But before we talk about that, what's worth noting is there are business benefits to complying with SOX, not just from a market perspective or for the government's or regulation angle, but for the internal businesses as well. So looking at the decade-long of SOX implementations, as well as programs set up across US listed companies, we can see clear evidence that a more strict control environment has been defined and controls are being polished on an ongoing basis with clear details of how to do day-to-day operation. So the environment is much more visible as well as detailed and controlled. And there's definitely an improvement on documentation for the listed company that had adopted a successful SOX program. So these documents include how we communicate to auditors, and because there's existing solution that supports collating information, preparation of document can be minimized or can be reduced significantly. And because directors are now directly involved in the soundness of the internal control landscape, there's more involvement from an audit committee. And because SOX is a much larger program than some of the smaller risk and compliance areas, from a regulatory standpoint, by implementing a SOX program, businesses are now more prone to look at what other silo transformations are happening in the risk and compliance landscape, whether they should be siloed or there's a common ground or common framework that can be adopted. So some of these businesses in the US have, because of their successful SOX program, they're able to then exploit any converging points and opportunities across their transformation. And also because SOX focuses heavily on what operational process you have in place to support your financial reporting or output. So process needs to be then standardized as well as clearly documented, so the business is more aware or has a clear grasp of how to manage their business processes. And then finally, all of these can only be achieved by using some kind of smart mechanism. Otherwise, the workload is too heavy. So it also reduces complexity when you introduce a technology or a stack of technologies to support your SOX program. So many things can then become automated. Tasks can be automated. Control assessment, risk assessment can be automated and monitored across the platform. Hence, knowing the efficiencies, the SLAs, any issues that arises in a single environment where data is shared. So these are some of the key benefits of SOX being implemented over the last decade in the US. Before I move on to the topic of today of how to operationalize UK SOX here, I just want to emphasize that in an ever-changing compliance landscape where there's more digital assets we're leveraging and businesses consistently evolving and the external landscape as well as factors are constantly changing, there's more and more challenges today in the security and compliance world as well as for the professionals, right? So now with SOX in place, it seems like the list of challenges just increased and the list of headaches just increased. So in order to make sure for business that the compliance landscape is efficient, we need to then proactively looking at what we're trying to be compliant against, understand how we can simplify different regulatory needs and simplify the amount of testing and evidence collecting needed if those things can be automated, or if the concept is if we can test one thing and satisfy many regulations, why not do that? To just save my resource time to focus on more important tasks or reallocate my resource pool to achieve other business benefits. So with that in mind, the bigger question is, now that listed companies will, in the next few years, need to be SOX compliant, how is a business going to approach that? Well, I can only see two paths. One is taking a quite reactive role and just focus on being compliant to SOX, which means all the cost associated or the resource included will be focusing on making sure that there's enough evidence going out to the auditor that in turn provides the assurance that the financial standing of the company is sound. However, if we look at the US case, the company that thrived most with their SOX program is understanding the bigger picture. What kind of business objective I'm trying to achieve across the risk and compliance landscape when it comes to SOX. So then I use this opportunity to help expand my or mature my existing risk and compliance culture and set up a new way of working or improved way of working so that I can get benefits out of the investment I made on this program. So I'm hoping people on this call is thinking about the latter option, because that's where I'm getting at with the next few slides. I'm not going to dwell much on this slide, but this is, if you Google starting steps for UK SOX, or look at any GRC vendor's website or any consulting website, it will always tell you to starting points to educate your C-suite, your board, establish a steering committee dedicated to SOX, have your vision, roadmaps, and also understand the business case and benefits for your long-term investment into the SOX compliance. So I'm not going to waste your time on that, because you can find this information easily and readily on the website, on the internet. But I do want to talk about how do we start operationalizing UK SOX though. So the first thing to think about is what's going on in my current risk and compliance landscape. Am I happy with the current risk culture, risk and control culture I have in place? If so, how do I embed those SOX compliance activities into that existing culture that I'm happy with and I think is mature? Alternatively, if I'm not happy with my current risk and control culture, then shouldn't I use this opportunity with the UK SOX to kind of transform how that culture, landscape, or framework look like, so that when UK SOX is operationalized and we're trying to be compliant with it, I'm actually in turn making my existing risk and control activities more mature and towards the business goals I might have set as a business. So that's something we need to think about as step one before we operationalize. What can we use? How can we leverage it? If we can't use it and need to come up with something new, how can that be shared to the wider risk and compliance landscape I have? The second thing then is, once I have that culture defined and whether I have that, target culture I want to get to, then is understand what risks are associated. So if we look at it from an enterprise risk perspective, there's the concept of principal risk. So the question is, do I have a mature list of principal risks I can leverage, somehow link together with the SOX compliance landscape I need to start formalizing as well as implement? If the answer is yes, great. If the answer is a bit shaky and in between, then the first question we need to ask ourselves is, how are these principal risks I have in place aligned to my future strategy as well as business model, especially taking SOX into consideration? Yeah. Under those principal risks, what key risks do I have that has a financial statement impact, right? If we're able to identify that, then perfect. We can still leverage our existing enterprise risk structure, but now we actually know that out of those, there are some high level key risks in there that is going to be SOX related. If at that point we still can't understand or determine whether the risk we have is going to be SOX related, then it needs a larger exercise to relook at the entire risk landscape, or to save costs and to ramp up UK SOX much faster, is look at specific SOX related risks that may impact your or that's associated with your operational processes. Because if you can't get the risk correct, then it's more likely that your principal risks are targeting at different control environments, hence not really helping the business from a top-down compliance management perspective and risk management perspective to understand what actions need to take, what decision needs to be done. Second point to look at is then, what are the processes I have in place? These are the operational processes that links to financial reporting. Do I understand my operational processes in that aspect? If not, how much more documentations, how much more accountability do I need to add against the design of my process to make sure that if an element of the process isn't performing to my expectation, what knock-on effect it has to my financial reporting or the different financial ledgers associated with that. From that point, then we can also then define what are our control objectives or control standards associated to those processes, thus completing the process to risk and control relationship. Now, it's all good now on paper that we know kind of what our landscape look like, what process we have in place, what risks are associated, and what control objectives are in place to mitigate that, to provide a level of confidence that if the control objectives are met, I know my process outcomes or the process itself is sound. But we then need to think about how to invest into actually achieving activities or responsibilities to make sure what we just set up as our structure is actually being maintained and managed and assessed correctly. So this is something to look at, is now knowing my process, my controls, and my risks. What do I have in place as a business then to assign the right resources against responsibility and activities? Do they have the experience or do they have the skill set? If not, we need to invest into our first line to make sure we have the right activities, processes of operating risk and control in place before we move on to anything else. Unfortunately, for UK SOX, we're looking into the 2020s. So companies will have its own IT stack, will have a lot of automated controls or security procedures already in place. So there's no point just building everything on paper and set up 3 lines of defense and look at the things in a manual way. It probably adds value to look at what's currently working well in your business. Like, do I have any financial controls already in place in my financial system? Do I have any operational controls in place set up to manage my HR tools or policy management tools, etc.? And by knowing that, then we start establishing what our key KRIs are and how we can automate that and how that links them back into the process risk and control landscape that we've defined in the previous 3 steps. And then finally, when we're confident with all of that, and we know that this is a sound solution that the business want to start implementing or drive towards in terms of SOX compliant, as well as embedding a better risk and control culture, then we start looking at, out of everything we define, how do we standardize some of the process activity we have, and then looking into technology to see how we can automate that or simplify that so the workload is not really increased for our compliance teams. So this is what I think a good starting place looking into how to operationalize SOX is. Before I move on to go into a bit of detail of how that SOX framework can look like, I'm going to trigger off a poll question just to understand from the audience how many organizations have already started planning their UK SOX compliance. Bear with me one moment so I can launch the poll. So if you look at the poll section on your WebEx, you should now have the option of choosing an answer. While I wait for the results to come in, I'll go in a bit more detail onto how we define the SOX framework. So when we start looking at framework in the compliance or risk landscape, it's really a smart way or efficient way for business to get the maximum out of the information they have. So it gets the bottom line is their data relationship, right? So as mentioned earlier, we're looking at how we can optimize our SOX approach. So the first thing we probably want to look at is what process library we have. If not, how do we set up our process library? At this point, we're still looking at SOX from a very top-down approach because there's a regulatory need, and there's probably various business objectives associated to why we need UK SOX. So we need to understand what kind of processes or unique operational process we have, so create a library, and these processes should link into financial ledgers. So if something is not operating effectively, we know exactly what financial areas that we're reporting is being impacted. And for larger organizations that have to deal with multiple regions, different technology stacks, different regulations elsewhere, et cetera, what's probably worthwhile to look at is how can you make those processes more granular to assess or own against, which is then your sub-process library. Again, some organizations may find it very appropriate to create localized versions of their process because they operate on a localized version. Others may find it better that we just break down the process to subsections because it's easier than to maintain those smaller processes and understand them and own them better. So at this point, now we have our process library. The next thing to look at is process risks. So this seems like common sense, but there's a bit of trickiness in this. The process risk associated to the SOX-related operational processes might not be the exact risk you have today in your risk registers or risk landscape. So how do we come up with a list of process risks? And these need to be unique risks in the first place because we want to have a master library of the risks we have associated to process. So how do we set up the appropriate level for our process risk? It can't be too granular or it can't be too summarized. The reason for that is if we try to do too granular process risks, and again, this goes into how do we operationalize SOX, leveraging existing risk and compliance landscape we have. So this exact scenario of being too granular might be we want to map our current cyber IT related level risks. We might have business risks at that level if we decided that in our GRC platform or in our methodology, we're taking a bottom-up approach, right? So what happens is you have a very detailed risk register that has tons and tons of risks collated across different business areas, etc. If we take that level of risk, we're doomed to fail to have an efficient SOX program because it's too complicated for second line and third line to navigate to the source problem, because when a single control fails, all kinds of lists of risks happen, and we have to go through list by list of risks where it doesn't really give that summarized view of what the business needs to do. And secondly, like mentioned earlier, our landscape is never static. So if we decide we have new service offerings, or we decide to change technology stack, or there's new external factors that need to be considered from environment, from the market, from politics, or from governments, then it's too exhaustive to have a massive first line exercise to maintain and reestablish that risk to process relationship, or potentially even controlled risk relationship. So risks cannot be too granular for the sake of SOX. Another thing to avoid is try not to put your principal risks or very high level risks as the risk associated process, because then it's hard to break it down. And in this specific scenario, what's happening is your risks actually, a single risk actually spans across multiple processes. So if the control fails, it's deficiencies against all of these processes. And then it's not enough granular information then for the business to truly understand what decision-making needs to happen here. And then how can then your directors attest with confidence that the process is operating effectively or ineffectively, right? So what essentially needs to happen is process risks should be at a level where unique risks are identified against key processes or sub-processes, and then from there, linked to your master controls. That's how granular risks need to be, right? No need to be more granular than that, and there's no point having a higher level risk than that spans across process. Just at a level where you're identifying unique risks against your operational processes. And then understand what kind of master controls you have in place. Now, what I mean by master control is not your control procedures, but the objectives as well as the standards associated to mitigating those potential issues or those risks that then allows you to be confident to say, actually, my processes are operating the way I expect based on the outcome I've seen against the controls or control objectives and standards. So this, in summary, is a top-down approach to to SOX. And this is how the US side probably started it a decade ago. But obviously, for most business today, especially listed company, we have large technology stack to look at different areas of risk and different areas of controls in a much more granular fashion. So if a business wants to do the UK SOX as a bare minimum, so they can get the auditors to review it and provide the required outputs for compliance, this is where you would end, right? But to fully operationalize your UK SOX, your framework needs to expand. It needs to expand into taking into consideration of what currently is in place in your business and other areas of risk and compliance. So one thing is you probably have localized version of risks, either business risks, operational risks, or IT risk that sits at different opcos, different regions. Well, how do those map against your process risk? Similarly, you might have operating controls, and these controls might be automated, already embedded into a technology you have, or it might be a preventive, or it might be a manual control, but you already assess it routinely against various cyber IT compliance related requirements. So you need to map that against your master control. What happens then is you no longer need to look at your master controls as the first point for self-assessment. You just roll up the results of your operating controls to understand where your objective is standing. And similarly, it gives you a much granular view of what's happening on your risk side. So risk assessment can be assessed at a local level. And if your business is already doing that perfect, as long as the mapping is correct, then at a process risk level, you can see exactly how that's impacting the overall process risk based on the numerous local risks associated to that that's already being managed by your first line today. And then we take it one step further. Many GRC tools out there is introducing the concept of indicators, and many frameworks out there today in risk compliance talks about indicators or metrics, right? So if the business is mature at this point to have continuous control monitoring on their automated controls or other aspects of KCIs or KRIs to look at different thresholds, so we're not looking at the overall landscape, but at specific points where certain metrics are not met, then why don't you also link that into the overall framework so that you get automated data feeding back into your top-down SOX framework? And this is where you join up your bottom-up to your top-down risk and compliance management or methodologies. And then from there, what you truly achieve in leveraging your existing GRC landscape is how you can aggregate activities upward to a level where it makes sense for business to quickly make decisions, and also how the leadership can then cascade that information down to manage and report against your activities and findings and outcomes. So this is one way of looking at SOX framework in the 2020s with existing technology already in place in the risk and compliance landscape. Just going to pause here for a moment to review the polls. So it seems like we have a even split of outcome where 27% says they're starting to looking into UK SOX, and then around 36 haven't, and another 36 have started to think about it. So at this point, what I suggest I do is, before discussing whether we should look at UK SOX or not at this point in time, is to explain kind of what can GRC's tool do to make that end-to-end compliance framework more achievable and leveraging existing technologies or methods, so that it's not a revamp from scratch. So at SureCloud, we're able to do continuous control monitoring where we integrate various tools to pull in specific metric threshold. So if the threshold is not met, then the control objective is getting flagged. So you know something's not working, because if you set those controls up in those systems, there's no point then to create a manual version of that and populate that or test against it manually on the when it's an automated IT control. Similarly, other way of looking at how we can get an efficient control library in place is the likes of a standardized and harmonized control framework. One example that SureCloud integrates to is a secure control framework. So in this scenario, you would pick your framework, you tailor your library to the need of the organization. These can be controls against various regulations, including SOX. And then you're able then to deploy those controls, the unique controls you have in place, to different operational areas and test locally. So what you get by end of that is how your different opcos, different regions are actually performing in terms of compliance. And then because it's all from a single source, which is managed centrally by the platform, and also pulls in any updates to regulations with this direct integration, you're able then to understand how compliant you are as a business as a whole. And because you have the regulation integration, you're then able to then dissect that data, look at how compliant you are against a specific regulation. And this is the scenario where then you test one control and you satisfy many regulations. And from a UK SOX perspective is, why now then consider, because US SOX is already there in SCF, but why not consider how UK SOX map to this? So while you're doing your regular compliance activities, your self-assessments, your design adequacy or operating effective testing on your controls, on your granular controls, pull that information up so you understand how compliant you're against specific areas of SOX. Maybe your UK SOX, like I mentioned earlier, is not that granular, but that's fine, because these controls then can feed up to those objectives. Then as a business, you no longer need to attest those objectives manually and reactively. Instead, just look at whether an objective has failed or has partially failed and understand what action needs to take place so the deficiency is resolved before end of the year. So some key recommendations is, don't reinvent the wheel. If you can leverage existing risk and compliance frameworks or operations you have and you're happy with them, please do so when applying SOX requirement. And one thing to think about is regulations no longer work in isolation. So how are you able then to reduce those mundane repetitive tasks for your compliance audit team, internal audit team, to embed a concept of testing once and satisfy many? So it's strategically deployed across all your regulatory landscape. And the third point is, please start planning SOX now, because like I mentioned earlier, it requires a lot of prerequisite thinking to make sure we set up the right backbones and frameworks before actually looking into how to create a solution out of it. So I think that's our recommendation based on the pool. I think for people that haven't started or thinking about it, it's a good point to start actually putting things down and plan ahead after the new year, because the amount of work needed probably requires at least 12 to 18 months of thinking beforehand. On that point, I'm going to hand back the the topic to everyone on the call. Please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or type it into the chat, and I'll try my best to address them. Okay. So I've seen a few. So first question is, who will be affected by UK SOX? Okay. So the ones that will be immediately affected will be the premium listed companies that's already highlighted in the white paper. And the second question is, from Jenny is, what is a realistic timeline to start planning my UK SOX program? So a realistic timeline is, you want to make sure that you have a tool in place at least 8 months, ideally a year, but at least 8 months in advance before you have to submit your first evidence for SOX compliance. If you backtrack that, is you need another 12 months or 18 months, depending on whether you just want to be compliant with SOX or you want to use this opportunity to revamp your risk and compliance landscape and leverage what you have. If that's the case, then you need at least 12 to 18 months in advance to make sure everything's planned out. All your committees are set up, all your stakeholders made aware, what resource gaps you have, how big of a transformation it is from a culture perspective, from a methodology perspective, as well as from a ways of working perspective, so that you have enough time then to select a vendor and build a SOX solution on time, roughly at least 8 months before the deadline of being compliant. So if we take that timeline into consideration, Jenny, to be safe, because the legislation can be passed in 2022. So to be safe, we should start looking into how we want to approach UK SOX right after the new year. And then finally, a question from Melissa is, how will the SureCloud tool support UK SOX? So again, because we don't know the details and the exact future requirements of SOX, it's hard to say that exactly what we need to have in the tool or what SureCloud is planning to do on this roadmap to make sure we're SOX compliant for UK. But looking at where the direction is going, we're going down a path which is very similar, or at least this year so far, it's going down a path very similar to how Sarbanes-Oxley Act is like in the US. If that's the case, the SureCloud platform already caters for SOX compliance. So because our GRC tool looks at risk and compliance from both a bottom up as well as a top down approach. So we already have the concept of multi-layered controls, what your objectives are, what your standards are. And we can integrate with existing harmonized control frameworks as well. And we're already doing so anyways to the likes of SCF, so that you don't have to redesign your control from scratch. And then things like processes, management of processes, management of risk, multi-level of risk, enterprise risk hierarchy, all of those already exist in our solution. So in terms of what SureCloud can do, if it's similar to US SOX, our platform is already able to achieve it. The only thing that might require slight tweaking, or we've done it for many clients for the US SOX compliance, is what does the business want at the end of the day in terms of a tracking mechanism or attestation mechanism against that director level attestation. So that's the only kind of variable in this topic that requires the requirements of a specific client or specific company. Other than that, the rest is already there in the system. Are there any more questions? Because Melissa's the last question I got. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll just quickly jump to the last slide. Yeah, so feel free to reach out to me or reach out to SureCloud if you have any further questions or want to discuss further around UK SOX. Conscious I went through just a very high level approach of how we operationalize UK SOX due to time, but I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation around those details. If you either reach out to the SureCloud social media platforms, or you can ping me on LinkedIn, my details displayed on the left, or alternatively, you can just drop me an email on my SureCloud email and I'll pick it up. And at SureCloud, we have some upcoming webinars around compliance, the next one being the 4th of November. And then later this month, we're also looking at how do we do continuous compliance. And there's a cyber threat briefing then in mid-December. If there's no questions at this point, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and hopefully this session is not a waste of time for you and you actually enjoyed it. And thank you so much for attending. I will be closing this webinar now.